So I think, Kusi gave us a great example of an impact-linked investment structure. And so I think looking at this case study, we can see how capital gets deployed kind of on the ground with the folks that are kind of creating the impact, and how can we bring additional capital into the conversation, right, into the mix, right? And so maybe what I'll do for my example is I'll talk a little bit about the aggregation kind of side of it, right? How do we bring capital together so that it can be leveraged and applied for impact? So this example that I will talk about is one that I've had a couple of opportunities recently to talk about. So I love kind of describing it and talking about it. This was a project that we did kind of in the middle of COVID. And so the situation was the following, right? So a public charity called Malaria No More had reached out to us saying, listen, we have this really kind of emergent and urgent challenge that we're wrestling with, right? The challenge was that there were 1,600 SME medical clinics in sub-Saharan Africa who were effectively on the verge of shuttering their doors permanently, right? And so these clinics are the local partners on the ground for Malaria No More's anti-malarial efforts. But Malaria No More wasn't even focused on the malaria piece of it, right? It was, right now, it was even more fundamental than that. It was like, we have to figure out a way to keep these folks alive during the pandemic, right? The idea was, people were under lockdowns. They weren't able to kind of get out and to get to these clinics. There wasn't, transportation options. Many of them were under mandated lockdowns. They don't have remittances coming in, right? And so these clinics were effectively completely drawn out on their working capital facilities, and they couldn't pay the rent and buy supplies and pay their staff, and that the challenge, the significant challenge, was that if these clinics had were laid off their workers and defaulted on their leases and the like, they would have shut down for good, leaving a population of about 5 million people without any access to healthcare whatsoever, right? So these are further afield medical clinics. It's kind of, in many cases, the only option that folks had, right? So this is the situation. And the question was, how can we get funding into the hands, into the bank accounts of these SMEs, these organizations, as quickly as possible, in order to kind of shore them up and to weather the storm of COVID, and get to a place where, effectively bridge them into the future, where the natural business can start running again, right? And so here, one of the things that we were solving for, which isn't always the case, but it certainly does come up in a number of instances. Here it was particularly pronounced, was speed. We didn't have a lot of time. We had to get capital unlocked as quickly as possible. Some of the initial ideas were to build a blended finance fund, right? Say, all right, well, we have, a couple of kind of important things were that Malaria No More is a very highly trusted organization, right? They have a long history of doing excellent work and have strong relationships with funders. So they had already had conversations with folks like MCJ Melior, Skoll Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates, who were ready to deploy about $1.5 million. The capital funding gap, though, was between $30 and $40 million. So how do we get that type of capital deployed in about 6 weeks with facing this challenge, right? And so what we were able to do was really kind of dig and get clear on kind of what's our why here, what are we trying to solve for, and what are our kind of major kind of impediments and obstacles. Speed, being one, right? So if we built a fund, I knew, right, kind of, if we try to build a fund here, patient is going to be dead on the operating table before we even show up, to the metaphorical operating room to render the assistance. And so what we were able to do was to use another common tool kind of in innovative finance and impact investing, in the form of credit support. So we knew that there were lenders to these medical clinics, right? They have working capital facilities. There was a lender in common, called the Medical Credit Fund, and the Medical Credit Fund was stuck. They couldn't, by their own covenants and by their own charter, and this is a very common provision, you can't lend to an insolvent borrower, right? You're blocked from lending, right? So how can we get these guys out of this position of insolvency? Well, the first thing you think is, we'll put a bunch of money in the bank account, and so you're not insolvent anymore, right? Well, we couldn't do that. So what we did is we said, all right, well, we can create a guarantee, and we can guarantee the debt, right, of those medical clinics. And so effectively we can go to the lender and say, all right, well, if they default, then you come talk to us and we'll make it whole, right? But now we have this gap between kind of the 1.5 that we had and the 30 to 40 that we needed. This is the other piece that comes in, which is the blending piece that Chrissy was talking about. We were able to bring DFC, the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, into the deal, where they were able to apply leverage on top of the 1.5, right? So in this case, the $1.5 million of guarantees that the foundations were willing to put up was able to unlock $17.5 million of guarantees by the DFC. And this is the other piece that's really cool in terms of how these tools work. When it comes to a guarantee, you don't oftentimes need 100% coverage. So that 17.5 or whatever, 19 was able to unlock plus, greater than $30 million of capital from the lender. The outcome, of course, was that we were able to get the capital deployed very quickly within the 6 weeks. If we it wasn't even, we didn't have to deploy capital. We were able to get the structure built and signed up so that the lender was able to get the loans flowing again. And ultimately the real outcome was that the loan, the capital was able to reach the hands of all 1,600 of the SME medical clinics. There's another piece to it, which I forgot to mention, right? Which is, on the timing bit, right? So we also knew that, in the space, working with a governmental organization, they can't move that fast, right? And so the other thing that we're able to do, right, just building in kind of these blended finance and impact innovative kind of principles into an entirely bespoke structure, was to sequence it, right? So that 1.5 effectively acted as a bridge guarantee to bridge the time horizon of about 10 months in terms of in order to accommodate DFC's internal processes to get the capital launch, right? So 10 months, I would say, is pretty fast for a DFI, right? If everyone was motivated, but it's still 10 months. And so this is an example in which we had to be creative kind of on the spot or on the fly, and solve for issues that were coming up, keeping in mind that we really needed to move fast, right? So, and so what did we do, right? We kind of said, all right, well, let's zoom in on what are the key blockages, and just solve for those, or what are the tools that we can have, right? There's no tool that exists to do this. All right, well, let's just make one up, and let's use principles from a lot of different things that people are familiar with and comfortable with, and they know how they work. Let's use as many of those ingredients as possible to kind of solve for the situation at hand.